be talking about Homer's The Odyssey today. This is a follow-up to our previous video about the Iliad. We decided to do them both kind of consecutively, so...
And the end of our whole summer of Odysseys.
Yeah, we had a lot of Odysseys this summer, so that's kind
Summer vacations.
Yeah, seriously, prolonged. Like in this one, it was like 20 years before you finally got home. So, yeah, I've been curious to hear what you thought of it. I know I was reading the Samuel Butler translation. What translation were you reading?
I ended up with the Samuel Butler because I like Butler's version of the Iliad best. But I also have the poetry version by Alexander Pope, and I have the poetry version by William Morris, which I didn't read the whole things, but I did kind of look at them, and their poetry definitely very different from reading a regular novel or prose, but they were good. I still say, because the original was poetry, I still say the Iliad and the Odyssey translate better to poetry better than prose. Though I think the right writer could make these books amazing as prose, but they'd have to not do a 100% accurate translation. Like the one thing I kept just getting frustrated with is every time you turn the page,
I love this.
Comes the morning, rosy-fingered dawn.
I'm going to get a tattoo down my arm. Just get it tattooed down my arm, so every time you see me, you see rosy-fingered dawn.
Right.
Everywhere.
And I'm sure it was a poetical device from the original, but to have kept it in the prose just comes across as stupid.
Yeah, it's like the beginning of every single paragraph in Samuel Butler's Odyssey translation. Almost every single paragraph. There are very few paragraphs that don't have it included. So yeah, it did get old really fast.
Yeah. And for those of you who have never read these, like I had never read them before we did this Iliad and Odyssey, the famous story about the Trojan horse is not in the Iliad where you expect it to be with the Trojan War. It's in the Odyssey.
Yeah.
And it's just a flashback.
Literally, and it's not even a big flashback. It's actually quite minuscule. So we think of it as this really big, important thing in Trojan history. It's a blip on the radar that happens to be mentioned for 5 seconds. It's kind of like that UFO that no one's really sure they actually saw. You know, it's so minuscule and I think so completely blown out of proportion by pop culture that it's really kind of laughable.
Yeah.
And it's also really, like, the way it gets blown out of proportion is really cheesy. Like, the whole circumstance is cheesy in and of itself. Like, they build a giant wooden horse and go hide in it and then pillage the city after. It's just kind of like, how stupid do you think these people are?
Yeah, and they think it's a gift.
Yeah. Ooh, thanks for this giant wooden, like, it must have been some wooden horse. Like, it had to be a work of art that they thought it was.
But they've been enemies for 10 years fighting these gory battles. And then all of a sudden they just agree to quit, and the Greeks leave behind a horse as a present. That doesn't...
Yeah, like, it's just kind of like... And the circumstances are not very clear in the Odyssey, so a lot of it is just based off of pop culture inference.
Yeah.
So it's not really that prominent of a detail.
And if you've heard details about the Odyssey, you know, things like the Cyclops and Circe and all that, the sirens, if you've heard about that without having read the Odyssey, one of the surprises I had is that those are all talked about in flashback and really aren't a major part of this book. They're kind of side things that, you know, occupy a very small percentage of the book. So all the coolest, most fantastical things in the Odyssey were just kind of breezed over, which I didn't like.
Yeah, I also think that Odysseus spends a lot of time not being himself.
Yeah. He's
a very deceptive person, so I'm just kind of like, what are you so afraid of? You're freaking, like, king of, what, Ithaca? You're freaking king. Like, if I was a king, I'd be like, bitches move, I'm a fucking king. Like, right. I'd be flaunting it. But this guy, like, he's almost afraid to be a king. Like, that's so weird to me. Especially, like, in light of the suitors coming to woo his wife. The whole time, I'd just be, like, busting heads the second I walked in. I would not have played it up. I would have ambushed him immediately. Like, I get, though, why he kind of had to do his deceptive phases. Because,
yeah, it's kind of cool that this old hermit kicks all our asses.
Yeah, it's really awesome. And it's kind of like, it does add to the drama. You wouldn't have much of a story if you just came in and slew everyone willy-nilly. So there is I do like that effect of the drama, but also it just doesn't, this guy's like, if you read the Iliad, you know this guy's a cocky guy. It doesn't seem characteristic of him to go this much undercover everywhere he goes.
Yeah.
And he's probably changed personas like 3 or 4 times in the story, I think, where he pretends to be like other people depending on who he's meeting or whatever. It's really strange. And
though he has been through a lot, 10 years of the gods sending him in the wrong directions, destroying his ship, killing his entire crew, and stranding him. Yeah, he probably did get taken down a few notches and wasn't so cocky anymore.
Yeah, plus he's older by that point, too.
Right.
He's war-torn and he's seen some shit. So, I mean, it makes sense, but at the same time, it's also kind of disappointing. So, but I do enjoy overall the story. I think it's an amazing myth. You get lots of fun, like, little other myths interspersed into it. Overall, I thought it was a great story. Of course, the rest of society must also think it's a great story because it's a huge classic. I read it in high school as required reading. So it was kind of nice, though, having read the poetry to see the prose version. Because I tended to get really, like, I had the same issue with the Iliad. I tended to get really distracted by the poetry when I was in high school, that I didn't necessarily catch all of the story. Yeah. Because I was just lost in some of the metaphor and some of the extra stuff. Whereas this one has some of those metaphors, but does a better job storytelling. So it was kind of nice to have the comparison of the two for me. And I actually like the prose version better.
I think I agree with you with that. Even though I like the poetry, it's that added rhythm and of the words that is the thing, and it does make it harder to follow the story. Even when I read short poems, a lot of times I have to read them 2-3 times before I really get it, because I have to cut through the artifice of the way the words are put together and things are said differently from normal speech. The Iliad and the Odyssey stand as very important influences on fantasy fiction, because from the Iliad comes all of your Conan style barbarian, war, blood and guts, sword wielding slaughter type fiction, all that He-Man kind of fiction. And from the Odyssey comes all of your more quest oriented stories like Lord of the Rings and Wheel of Time and stuff like that are all kind of based on that original Odyssey foundation. So in these 2 books, Homer, or whatever poets really existed, because a lot of scholars don't even think Homer was a real person. They set the foundation for most of modern fantasy, and a lot of the other myths that like Arthurian legend and stuff like that came after. You can see the echoes of that story in it, which of course Joseph Campbell would have a lot of really good words about how yes, that's a thread that runs through all societies, the hero with 1,000 faces. Yeah. Beyond that, though, you had something to say.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Beyond that, though, for the modern reader, the Odyssey is more palatable. It's a little more politically correct. The Iliad was not anywhere near politically correct.
No.
Okay, so you have to be prepared for that.
Yes.
The Odyssey doesn't have all that. The Odyssey, as a matter of fact, Samuel Butler, that wrote this translation we read, he actually wrote a whole book on his theory that the Odyssey was written by a woman, because it is so different from the Iliad.
That's what I was going to
say.
say.
The Iliad is so He-Man grunting, slaughtering, raping, pillaging, and there's none of that in the Odyssey. There's just a little bit at the end where Odysseus slaughters everybody.
Yeah. I think, though, the reason... I see where he's coming from on that, but I don't necessarily agree. Mainly because I don't know that it was written by a female, but it definitely has a lot more female characters that are represented than there are in the other one. Because that is a war story. Women didn't go to war. They weren't really a part of it. Like, you get some of that female voice in, like, Hector's mother and Helen in the Iliad. But in the Odyssey, you have far more female characters with far more female, voices. So you're dealing with, Odysseus' wife. You're dealing with Circe. You're dealing with all of these other particular female characters with very distinct female traits.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of does change the tone because you do suddenly have a feminine influence when you didn't in the Iliad.
Yeah.
Just because it was so war-torn and gross and gory. But there is still that element, too, because Odysseus is still, fighting and his men are getting eaten at one point by that, what's it called again?
Polyphemus, the Cyclops.
Yep. And then there's the other thing, the multi-headed...
Hydra.
The Hydra, there it is. Words are hard, I struggle. The Hydra that came and, plucked his guys out of the...
No, I'm thinking wrong story. That's Jason is the Hydra. Scylla and Charybdis, one of them is the thing that came out from the rocks and was eating people off the ship.
Yeah, and then there's the Whirlpool was the other one.
Yeah.
Whatever the other one was called.
I get those mixed up.
Yeah, but then you get, you do have those gory scenes that are still kind of have that presence, the slaying of various persons in the Iliad. So I don't necessarily think that it was I personally don't think it was a male versus female writing style. I think it was just a male versus female circumstance that changed the tone. But I totally understand where Samuel Butler is coming from when he says, I think this was also potentially written by a woman.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't get to know that for sure, but I do think the circumstances change so drastically, it's hard to really, truly compare and even theorize.
But this is another one where the books are 3,000 years old.
Yeah.
You have to understand that going into it, that you're not reading contemporary literature. And even the Samuel Butler translation dates from the late 1800s, so his writing style is not current. And the one thing I kept thinking is that some really great writer should take these stories and write it in modern prose. And I bet it would just be awesome.
I think it would be really cool. Or develop it as if it's an urban fantasy sort of thing would be interesting.
I was thinking try and turn it into a space opera, but I don't know, that might not work.
mean, you could.
The Iliad would be hard because it's so much personal one-on-one battle.
That's true.
And that would be hard in a space opera.
It would be a lot of lightsaber
authors
duels.
out there, give it a shot.
It's hundreds of lightsaber duels all happen. Basically.
Or personal space suits with jetpacks rocketing around. Just something like that. Yeah.
Pew, pew. At each other. I don't know. In the depths of space. Yeah, I think the Iliad, it would be difficult, but I think you could definitely do that with the Odyssey. Another thing I thought was really interesting is going back to the idea that it could have been multiple people instead of just one person named Homer who came up with this. We do have to remember this was originally an oral story.
Yeah.
This was not meant to be written down. This was meant to be sung or shared. Thus the poetry, specifically because poetry translates into lyrics and songs much better. Yep. And songs are easier for the human psyche to remember usually than just written words. But it's interesting because the story we have now may not have been the original story.
No, it probably wasn't, because try to imagine all these bards wandering all over, remembering all of this exactly and repeating it. I mean, I know they were pretty good. We know the medieval scribes were ridiculously anal about keeping things accurate when they were rewriting books from earlier copies, but still oral tradition. There's got to be things that changed over the years, and who knows how many hundreds of years these stories were being told before anybody ever wrote them down.
Mm-hmm. So we do have that interesting translation from potentially a large-scale version of telephone.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have the influence of the winners got to tell the history.
Yes.
So when you end up having war things like this, it's usually the winners and the survivors who make up history as they go tend to be a little bit more epic and heroic than it actually was. And you see that in the Iliad a lot. A lot of this is war is really glorified in there, no matter how gory or disgusting it is. So you kind of see that in the Odyssey as well, that all of these feats were really overly glorified when really it took some guy 20 years to get home to his wife, who missed him like crazy. But also, like...
Yeah, can you imagine the frying pan over the head when he walked in
the
the
door? He was, like, kidnapped by a female goddess and, like, basically raped. Was it? We don't know. He probably enjoyed it. We don't know.
Sounds like a really good story to try and tell your wife when you come home from the bar.
Yeah, that's like the story I would not tell my wife. I'd be like, yeah, it took me 20 years to get home. And then guys tried to kill me.
I'm late because somebody tried to eat me and I almost got swallowed by a sinkhole, and
Circe was doing
and then this woman
something.
Captured me and held me prisoner and tortured me.
She tried to make me immortal, and her husband. It was weird. Like, just how do you pass that off so casually to your poor wife who's been waiting 20 years and bawling her eyes out for 20 years trying to freaking wait for you?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I'd just be angry. Like, if I was that wife, I'd just be like, you made me do what? I would have beat him with a lyre or something.
Well, and that's the other aspect of this story is Penelope, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Penelope is waiting for him for 20 years, and there are all these young studs hanging around her house from rich families that want to marry her. Are you buying this? And she's going to sit in a room and make a loom and hold all of them off and cry about it?
Cry for 20 years.
I don't know.
Every night for 20 years, they say she cried. Just about every time you see her. Tears in her eyes.
Mm-hmm. She's a saint.
Yeah. No, there's no way. Not with that many dudes in my house. I'd be like, hello, sailor. It's just... a woman's got to get lonely. But yeah, it's still a very sweet and romantic tale. You know, there's probably a lot that wasn't told, assuming the story's even true.
Yeah.
A lot of people take this as both myth and history because there is evidence that some of these characters did in fact exist.
Yeah, I saw a documentary once where an archaeologist found the walls of Troy where Achilles was supposedly chasing Hector?
Yep.
Around the city a number of times, and they actually found the remains of the wall and tracked how big it was and figured out that, yeah, it probably was true.
Yeah. So it's interesting because there's a combination of myth and, I mean, we have the same issues with the Bible these days too, where so many people are like, how much of it is myth and how much of it is real? And, you know, you do have that interesting issue of people get to rewrite history once they've won.
Mm-hmm.
So how much of it do we take with a grain of salt and how much don't we? So it's kind of cool to encounter more ancient literature. Another one is the Epic of Gilgamesh, where there are a lot of histories of the Bible that are proven to have been true because they're reiterated in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah, like the floods.
Yeah, like the floods and things like that. Certain characters are mentioned that could be interchangeable characters between scripture and things like that. So it's really interesting when you encounter these ancient tales and myths, whatever you want to call them, scriptures, volumes. They do make you wonder about the absoluteness of the past and the history as we know it. Just because there is so much to wonder about.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think that's really interesting when you kind of start reading more ancient literature, really old stuff, even like if you start reading medieval things like the Canterbury Tales and stuff like that. You start getting these little bits and pieces of other myths or urban legends, even we could call them,
Yeah.
for their time. So it's just really interesting when you encounter these literatures and you can see the parallels between actual history and what was just poetic flourish or what was, you know, to add to the story or whatever. It's just really interesting.
And I want to take note, I had an odyssey with trying to find the right copy to read, because I started out with paperback editions that were translated by a guy named W.H.D. Rouse. Those were the standard paperbacks that you could find in bookstores all through the 1980s, 1990s. If you went to B. Dalton or Walden Books, that's what was there for the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so that's what I bought. But I started reading the Iliad in that translation, and I just hated it. It was horrible. Mm-hmm. And so then I looked for other translations. That's when I came across the Alexander Pope, and I came across the William Morris version of the Odyssey. Apparently he didn't do the Iliad, which is weird, but hey, whatever.
Some people didn't care that much about who got their guts wrung out of them. By who. So
Emily gave me a copy of the Iliad, an older book that she had that was translated by Samuel Butler, and I read that, and that was readable. Mm-hmm. That was enjoyable.
Easier to digest, I think, than some.
Yeah, but I didn't have the Odyssey. I found an ebook of the Odyssey and was reading that, but that one they changed all the names to the Roman names, so it was kind of confusing.
Yeah, that's another thing about history that's really difficult, is people had more than one name. I don't know why.
Well, specifically, Roman translations of Greek works, all the gods, the Romans changed the name. Mm-hmm. So Zeus was Jupiter, and Athena was Minerva, Odysseus was Ulysses, and that gets confusing after reading the Iliad with all the Greek names, and then go to the Odyssey with all the Roman names. Mm-hmm. So I was in B. Dalton, and I finished up the Odyssey with this edition, which
it's beautiful.
I love. This cover, beautiful. The green against the, oh man. This is
that
just
gold edging. Stunning. Oh, look at
interior end papers. Not an expensive edition. I think this was $25 at B. Dalton. But it's beautiful. And another thing I liked is the typography. The editions I was reading, the lines were really close together, a lot of words per page, which made it hard to read. This one, they opened up the leading, which of course means about an extra 70 pages to the whole thing, but it was worth it. It was a lot easier.
And it's nice, it's bigger type. So people who have a harder time reading or need bifocals or glasses or anything, it's a lot easier of a read, I think.
And this edition, Barnes & Noble gives you a nice little satin bookmark built right into the book.
Those. I love built-in bookmarks
when they do that.
Otherwise, it's just like coupons or junk mail that ends up being my bookmark.
No, we're not getting kickbacks from
this is not sponsored.
From Barnes & Noble.
We are not sponsored.
I wish they did. Barnes & Noble, if you want to send me money for pushing your book, 1408 Annie Court, Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Send the check, however much you want. But otherwise, I love this edition. This, and I've looked online for vintage copies of this book. This is what I decided on, because this is the most beautiful book edition.
My copies,
half of what we're here for.
My copies were nice, but they just happened to be really nice vintage ones that I just happened to have received them in some of those box openings that I did. Maybe you'll see those in some previous videos, but I just happened
those,
to get them.
Especially the interior illustrations, which I believe this lacks. This doesn't have those illustrations. And those are really nice for that.
Yeah, they did have some. I thought it was kind of cool because they had actually pulled those illustrations from actual vase illustrations.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so they were pulled from actual vase illustrations and kind of combined as they needed different characters to make sense for the story. Okay. So all of that was illustrated from actual Greek and Roman art, which I thought was really, really nicely done, and just kind of making sure that they were true to the essence of the work. I thought that was really worthwhile. Also, I liked maps. They had maps in there. So I'm like, where the hell is he now? I liked that at Gregor Maguire's the Wicked series. You need maps for that one too.
Lord of the Rings, I believe my copy of Lord of the Rings.
I have the whole Atlas book just because there's just so much to keep track of.
Wow.
Middle Earth is pretty big.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, references to the West and things like that, and, like, certain names of things, like, yeah. I took a history of Middle Earth class in college, and it was required reading, but still, it was very helpful, because you don't understand sometimes how long these journeys really are for people, unless you have maps to really realize, like, these are continents away. So I appreciated that a lot. I like having maps and books, and I thought in my copies of the Odyssey and the Iliad.
Well, and anybody with a Dungeons and Dragons background is gonna want maps.
Yes.
Because we had a whole room full. I worked there for a year, got to know a little bit of the people there, and they had a room full of map makers that did an amazing job on those maps, and how quickly they turned them out.
Yeah.
But they were talented artists.
Yeah, and it's just so helpful, I think, for readers to have a better understanding of distance and time. So for me, it was like, 20 years is an awfully long time to not, to be that away from home and to take that long to get home. But when you think about how distant he was continents away. Mm-hmm. Like entire continents and seas away. So it helped me have a better understanding of the character and the plight he was in, and how drastic, like what drastic circumstances these were to be lost on the ocean for, 10 days or whatever it was he was floating around and somehow not dying from drinking seawater. Anyway, but yeah, I like the fantasy element for sure, and maps are very helpful.
Yeah. That's another point about the Odyssey, though, is the fact that he got lost for 10 years in the Mediterranean. Okay, you can probably take a cruise of the Mediterranean in a week on today's ships and never get lost. Back then, the ships were very different from ships today, and seafaring was way different from the technology we have today. But it's really hard today to grasp why he would be lost for 10 years on a sea that he's familiar with, in following a shoreline that he's familiar with, and
it is. It would have had to been very, the myths would have had to happen for him to be stopped so much. Really,
well, that's where you can believe that the gods had to have interfered.
Yeah, because
it's just not believable that he would be that stupid.
Yeah, and there's a lot of times too where he came really close to being home, and then whoop. I liked, though, how they portrayed him going to the underworld.
Yeah.
I really liked that sequence, and I thought it was interesting, like, the communications he had between the dead, and, like, how people he had been at war with reacted to him, having encountered them. Like, some people were really pissed, but we don't get that story in the frickin' Iliad. No. I don't know why. I want to know why they're pissed at Odysseus. Come on, give me more. Like, yeah. So there's a lot of extra stories that, aren't being told, because, like, the reactions of the dead to him, some of them were, like, glad to see him, and some of them were, like, wouldn't even talk to him. Like, they didn't want to acknowledge he was there. Like, they wanted to acknowledge he was there, but really make sure that he knew, we aren't talking to you. So I want to know those stories. I also like that Agamemnon was killed by his own wife.
Yeah.
That was fun.
Yeah.
He was kind of a jerk.
Yeah, he was totally a jerk, especially if you've ever seen the movie Troy. He's portrayed as a complete asshole in that movie.
Yeah. And he kind of was. He had on and off moments in the Iliad, and to see, like, what becomes of him in the Odyssey is kind of like, haha. Yeah,
you can kind of understand why Achilles said screw you in the beginning of the Iliad.
Like, this guy is not, he's really good at being an asshole to everybody, so it's kind of, it was kind of cool, actually, to see him get his just desserts, and his wife to be like, yeah, you were an asshole. Here's my new lover. Bye. Yeah. Killed him. Lady power. Anyway.
Okay, that's all I got. You got anything else to say
I think that's it. We covered everything. Overall, it's a very historic and important story. For ancient literature, that we don't have a lot of ancient literature that still survived. No. So to have things like this, to have things like the Bible, to have things like the Quran and the Epic of Gilgamesh, words are hard, are really actually, we're very fortunate to have those pieces of history. Even though it's up to debate how much of it is history, we're very fortunate to have them survive and have them be like the building blocks of storytelling.
Yeah, but for the modern reader, you, like I said, you see the foundations of all of our fantasy books in all these old, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Morte d'Arthur, Beowulf. All those stories are where our fantasy fiction comes from. It originates. All the tropes of today's fantasy comes from those stories, and the mythologies, Norse mythology, Greek mythology. That is the source of most fantasy today.
Yeah.
So for the modern fantasy reader, forget about whether it's historically true or not. Just enjoy the stories.
Exactly. Yes, they're important. They were building blocks, and we are just fortunate to have them. That's really what it comes down to. So, yeah, so tell us what you think. Like, share, follow, let us know. Is there a translation that you prefer? I think that's a good one because there are so many translations out there of various things. And even like, this is an English translation. If you have a foreign language translation that's specifically you think really good, I think that would be an interesting discussion as well.
I wonder how this comes across in Chinese or Russian.
Or French, even. Like, you never know. So, yeah, go ahead and let us know. Comment below. Tell us what you thought of the Odyssey. And we will see you next time. Thanks, guys.
So long.
See ya.